Greetings everybody, welcome to episode 2 of our mini-series about artificial intelligence on the Medical Device Regulatory Affairs podcast from MediQuest. Thought this was a good time just to do a little bit of a refresher, some of the basics, and in particular looking back, it's 2 years since we did our first podcast on artificial intelligence, and in that time quite a few things have changed. First podcast was when the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, the EU AIA, was first published, and we talked about some of the issues that we foresaw on that. And actually, I feel I was a little bit prophetic about some of them, but we'll maybe talk about that in a later episode. Since then, about a year ago, we got some really good guidance from FDA about software for medical devices incorporating artificial intelligence and how that should be regulated. Basically, their idea was quite a neat one, moving on the idea of regulation, that we define a little area, a field in which the algorithm can roam. And if long as the algorithm roams within that field, within that idea, and is just about trying to see things better and make better use of the data within that field, within those limits, then it's fine to go on doing that without further review from FDA. So really it's a sort of pre-approval as long as the algorithm doesn't manage to stray too far from where FDA have seen it. And that's really quite a big step in changing from the old-fashioned view of regulation to a more agile view. And recently we've had the UK artificial intelligence strategy, and that seems to have encouraged quite a lot of investment. Last words, very few actions from what appears to be a dying administration. So I'm not too sure how much weight we can put on this, but again, it seems to be everything seems to be happening in Europe, in the US, in the UK, that is looking towards encouraging medical devices with an artificial intelligence content. Since the pandemic, actually I was reminded of this because I've got this rather nice Irish Runner, Virtual Runner t-shirt on from 2021. So when we did our first Artificial Intelligence Act podcast, it was still basically in the lockdown season, and the first Irish Runner event that I did was a virtual one. Last one this year, well, we had a good few thousand people at Croke Park, so things have changed very much over the last 2 years. One of the important ways it's changed, we've all got used to having health apps on our phone, and I don't necessarily mean just the Apple health apps. I mean health apps from healthcare providers, from private health companies, well-being apps, general health apps, what I would term non-regulated apps, but also of course the COVID apps and the COVID tracker apps, the contact tracing apps from the government. And those are really important because that sets a new idea that we've allowed the government onto our personal devices. We've allowed the government in certain precise circumstances to know where we are. We can no longer claim that tracking information, that some of our personal details are things that we don't want the government to know, because we've now taken the initiative in telling them. So the world has moved on. Interestingly, there was a prediction the societal demographics were going to change, that because COVID appeared to particularly affect more elderly people, we were going to see a reduction in the average age of the population and therefore the healthcare need. That hasn't actually come to pass. Although a lot of elderly people did die of COVID, they probably weren't going to live terribly long anyway. And so it hasn't really changed things. The population demographics, the demographics of our society have pretty much stayed the same, which really means that we've still got the same issue about an ageing population, about caring for the elderly, and the need to address prevention rather than cure. That we're now very much looking for artificial intelligence to be our salvation in this area, because it enables us to get a much earlier, more accurate diagnosis before people start showing symptoms of disease. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the issues that have come to light. And the first one is data quality. Not all our phones, not all our watches, and not all of the apps we run on them have the same accuracy. I think this leads on to what I was saying about data from non-regulated apps. We've allowed a lot of health and well-being apps into our environment, and on the whole, those are unregulated. We don't really know how accurate a lot of these things are. They tend to make fairly low claims, but give probably more accurate data. But I'm sure you're all aware of the health apps or the heart rate monitor that's either told you you've got a heart rate of about 300 or you're dead. Neither of which is actually likely to be true. So data quality will become a real issue if we're looking to introduce data from unregulated sources. Well, we're starting to do that already. We've got asthma apps, for example, that will bring in weather data, that will bring in geolocation data, because that can be important, that will bring in your exercise data. So if we're going to be using this data as part of a formal diagnosis, we need to be sure about its quality. Also about its confidentiality. It needs to be something that you've given to us for a diagnosis, not something that we've just harvested from your Strava, Garmin, other healthcare trackers are available. Apps. I talked about the FDA process of saying there's a limited area within which AI can roam, and the idea of putting very hard crash barriers around that. When you get too close to the crash barrier, the algorithm stops developing. And then there's the issue of how do we move those crash barriers? How hard are they? What's going to count as a change? Do we just extend with the same principles, the same policy that we had originally, or are we looking for something more as we get further away from the original submission data? Again, FDA's started to think about these sort of issues, but we haven't quite gotten to what I think is going to be an end point yet. And then we've got the proverbial subject of ethics around AI. I'll come back time and time again to ethics in this one. It's very easy to deal with the black and white ethical issues, and we've made a lot of progress in writing down some of the ethical rules about what AI should be doing. Should be, for example, informing the patient. But all patients? Always? What if the patient mental health is in question and this is going to aggravate any condition by increasing anxiety? Should we then have to inform the patient? So we have a number of important issues that we need to consider. We also have some life cycle issues that we haven't been forced to consider before. I suppose if you go back to the old days, we dealt very much with a medical device and thought it was going to be static throughout its life. It wasn't going to change. And then we got to the idea of, well, it's going to be reviewed every year or so by a notified body, and perhaps we're going to need to update the technical file. Maybe we can do this one big revision every year or every 2 years when we make a significant change. Maybe rather than making a lot of little changes where we have to update every time, we can bundle them together. And the idea of saving up for revision came along. Now with AI, we've talked about this idea of moving away from crash barriers to perhaps more movable barriers. As the AI algorithm starts to improve itself and become better, then maybe we can just move the crash barriers around it, rather than saying now you're straying out of your approved zone. And how do we go about this? And are we going to have to be monitoring where the AI in all possible deployments is going to throughout the life cycle, so we know how to move these crash barriers, and so we know when we have to inform the regulator that the AI has moved. It's no longer what was in the original submission, but we're still following these same processes. And then lastly, we've got the idea of a true full life cycle. And this can be really important. We're talking about software. It may reside on your phone, on your PC, on your iPad for much longer than you think. I've got a lot of apps on my phone that were perhaps on the phone I had maybe 10 years ago. I've still kept the same app. It's been updated fairly regularly. When I've got a new phone, I've set up the new phone from the old phone, so it's automatically been copied across. I may not use it much, but it's still on my phone. If that was a healthcare app and I wanted to use it, would the company that wrote it, would the developer that wrote it still be liable? They might not even be about now. Even the developer, the last person who knew anything about it might have died or moved on or have lost contact. How are we going to look after some of the life cycle issues around apps? So there are a number of big issues that we've still got about artificial intelligence and the interplay with medical devices. And we're going to be talking more about these over the coming weeks. But very much what I wanted to do this week, while Sophie's away on holiday, was just to set out the stall, set out a little bit of the background. And I hope you felt that was worthwhile. See you again next week.